I've watched a lot of shows that got robbed of a proper ending, but few of them hurt quite like this one. I know it's cheesy sometimes, and you can really tell that it's a low-budget syndicated 90s show, but there is something comforting about that 90s TV feel for me. I think any adaptation of Eric Draven carries a little extra weight since The Crow is so closely tied to Brandon Lee's tragic death. And Mark Dacascos really carried the torch left by Brandon Lee in his own way and made me a huge fan of his. I also love how Eric's story and the mythology were evolving and getting more interesting throughout the show, but then it just got cancelled instead of giving us that second season. And by the time we reach the final episode, Eric is separated from the Crow, stripped of his powers, and forced to watch Shelly disappear into a cosmic void. It was supposed to launch season 2, but instead it became one of television's most painful, unresolved cliffhangers. So, what actually happened and how did it end? Let's find out. Turning a one-night tragedy into a TV series. You see, The Crow was never really built to be a long-running TV series, as James O'Barr's original comic and the 1994 movie tell a complete story. Eric and Shelly are murdered, Eric comes back, gets his revenge, and that is basically it. It was always going to be difficult to turn that into a weekly show because it can't have Eric getting revenge every episode. I mean, he would run out of people to kill pretty damn quickly. So the creators needed to find a way to keep Eric's journey going without taking away the emotional arc of the original story. Creator Bryce Zabel decided to make Eric come back 1 year after his death, but Shelly becomes trapped in the land of the dead because she refuses to move on without him. Eric is then pulled back into the world of the living, where he starts helping people who have been wronged. I really like this concept because on paper, the story is just Eric getting revenge, but the real question here is whether Eric can become someone who is not driven by anger and revenge, and whether he can actually earn his chance to be with Shelly again. So really, the show is a love story, but just happens to look like a revenge story on the surface. Now, of course, they couldn't keep everything as dark or graphic as the movie, and so the violence had to be toned down, but the show still tried to hold on to themes like grief, the afterlife, Eric's connection to music, and his struggle to find peace. When you consider all this, I actually think that pilot works better. The show also gives Eric abilities to make this weekly format possible. He can heal from injuries that should actually kill him, and he also has psychometry, meaning that he can see the history of an object by touching it. He can even push those visions onto someone else, making his supernatural side quite useful in the show when he investigates what happened to victims. How the show worked week to week. Eric basically becomes almost like a supernatural troubleshooter. He gets involved whenever someone falls into trouble, and since he's literally a dead man who has supernatural powers, he can investigate things that normal detectives can't. The cases include people being abandoned, exploited, outright murdered, or denied justice, and a lot of them hit a little too close to home for Eric. He also has encounters with other supernatural characters, such as another crow called Hannah, who is also known as Talon, and comes back after her own murder just like Eric. There are also stories that explore what happens when someone who comes back from the dead refuses to move on, which expands the mythology of the show through characters like Skull Cowboy and a crow from the past called Blackfeather. So the show kind of gives more of the feel of a supernatural crime series compared to the movie, with Eric basically moving between cases while trying to figure out what the hell he is supposed to do with this second chance. Because, see, the movie can keep Eric mysterious, as we don't really need to know what his life looks like outside of the revenge story, but in the series, Eric has to exist in the world again and needs somewhere to stay and interact with people. He also returns to his old band and performs with them at one point, and all of it makes Eric much more like an actual person again, rather than someone showing up to help someone get revenge. The first half of the season is also much more episodic, as Eric mostly deals with individual cases, but the second half then starts building a larger mythology and a more continuous storyline. I feel that the individual cases are what make the premise work as television, but once the mythology starts expanding, it's clear that the writers are actually trying to build a whole world around the Crow. Following Brandon Lee without replacing him. After Brandon Lee's death during the making of the 1994 film, his performance as Eric Draven became tied to a real tragedy. So Dacascos knew that he was stepping into a character that we already deeply associated with Lee. I mean, you can't really talk about this character without thinking about Brandon, and he has also spoken openly about that pressure at a Supernova panel. I was nervous because it's hard to get Brandon Lee out of your head when you're reading that script. And then the pressure really came. Now, what do you do with 22 hours of this story? And I think that was exactly the right choice. I tried to approach it from my experience, from my heart. I love how Dacascos never tries to recreate Brandon Lee's performance. He couldn't be Brandon Lee, and he didn't need to be. But there's a natural charisma to him that makes Eric easy to spend 22 episodes with. The show can get cheesy, but Dacascos has enough personality to make a lot of it work. Even some of the original film's music was reused in the show, and this makes it impossible to ignore the connection to Brandon Lee's version, even while Dacascos was trying to make Eric his own. They also put a lot of work into choosing the right person to play Eric Draven, as he put it. So I had a full-on screen test with wig and makeup. Actually, it was a 4-hour screen test. I did 3 different things, and a week later they called up and said I had the part. Ever since I watched this show, it's fair to say that I'll watch Mark Dacascos in almost anything now. And once Dacascos got the role, the supporting cast also made the series work well. Mark Gomez's Albrecht becomes this really interesting bridge between Eric and the normal world, and at first he obviously doesn't trust this mysterious guy who keeps turning up around dead bodies, but watching that relationship grow helps keep Eric grounded. Then there's Sarah, played by Katie Stewart, who becomes probably the most important connection Eric has to the living world. And I actually really like their relationship because Sarah actually knows him underneath and doesn't just treat him like some supernatural superhero. Shelly, meanwhile, who is played by Sabine Carcenti, represents everything Eric has lost and everything he is still desperately trying to get back. Then there's also Linda Boyd as Sarah's mother, Darla, and Christina Cox as Albrecht's new partner, Detective Jessica Capshaw. All of these relationships give Eric a life beyond the cases he investigates, and I think that adds a lot more depth to the story. The darkness behind the production. Making The Crow Stairway to Heaven was clearly physically demanding. The show was filmed around Vancouver, which doubled as the fictional Port Columbia, and a lot of the filming involved rain, night shoots, martial arts, and stunt work. On top of all this, Mark Dacascos was playing a character whose entire existence revolved around grief, anger, and death, which made the production schedule probably pretty exhausting. And the production even suffered a real tragedy in the middle of August in 1998. There was a location shoot at Manatee Bay, which is north of Vancouver near Squamish, where the crew was filming a controlled explosion involving a rowboat. Mark Dacascos was a 44-year-old stuntman who had worked on films including Rumble in the Bronx. So he was watching the setup, but danger came from somewhere no one expected. Corporal Gary Brine of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police explained what happened. The piece of debris was sent up in the air, cleared a large tree, and came down to strike the victim on the head. Dacascos was hit by the debris and died from his injuries. The Seattle Times reported that Dacascos was simply a bystander when he suffered the fatal injury. Fellow stuntman Laura Chartrand also explained the explosion was not part of a stunt, and Dacascos had nothing to do with it. Only 6 of the season's 22 episodes had reportedly been filmed at the time, and the production was suspended for around 10 days before eventually continuing, but the show's release date was unaffected. Crescent Entertainment also released a statement expressing their deepest sympathy and condolences to his family. Now, I know it's very tempting, especially with The Crow, to look at something like this and turn it into some supernatural story, since Brandon Lee had already died during the making of the 1994 film. So another death happening during the production of a Crow project naturally seems eerie. But I don't think we should treat it as some piece of dark trivia to add to the Crow's already tragic history. A real person lost his life in a terrible accident, and his death affected the people who were actually there. So it had nothing to do with Brandon Lee's death, and nothing to do with the cancellation of the series, and I think that's how it should be remembered. Revenge was never enough. An interesting thing about The Crow Stairway to Heaven is that the end goal is not Eric's revenge. That's the idea that was built into Bryce Zabel's original plan for the series, and the Crow TV Bible describes it pretty perfectly. Even a dead man needs to get a life. That may sound funny at first, but think about it. Eric can't spend the entire series hiding behind the Crow and only appearing whenever someone needs to be punished. He has to interact with the world as Eric Draven, too. Sure, he does not eat, drink, or sleep anymore, and he has powers he definitely did not have when he was alive, but music is still there. He's still Eric Draven, the musician, and those little pieces of his old life help him feel connected to his human self. Then there's Shelly, who is the main reason for why Eric can't move on. Their relationship is still at the heart of his story, but Eric has to change before he can even think about being reunited with her. Only getting revenge cannot magically bring his old life back. This is why Sarah is also so important. She already knew Eric and Shelly when they were alive and trying to help her. So every time Eric is around Sarah, he gets reminded of the life he actually lost before he became consumed by revenge. You can actually see that change starting very early in the series when Eric tracks down the people responsible for killing him and Shelly and gets the chance to destroy them. Sarah asks him to let them live. It's a small moment, but I think it tells you what this version of Eric is supposed to become. Sometimes the show goes beyond Eric's own story, especially when Eric ends up helping Talon with what happened to her. I like stories like this because they suggest that there is a much bigger mythology behind the Crow, with other people who have been brought back and have to figure out what they are supposed to do with that second chance. That mythology eventually leads to the Lazarus Group and its leader, Frederick Balsam, who turns his attention towards the Crow to subvert it and use its power for its own purposes. So Eric's personal struggle becomes more about immortality and control. But I think the series' most interesting question stays pretty simple: whether a man who is resurrected through grief can use the power born from his vengeance without allowing that vengeance to define him. A Gathering Storm, the actual final episode. And then we get to A Gathering Storm. If you are watching this expecting a proper series finale, oh boy, you are going to be disappointed. It feels more like the episode right before the story gets even crazier. The episode aired on the 22nd of May, 1999, leaving Eric in an even bigger mess. The main villain here is Frederick Balsam, who has already managed to transfer his soul into the body of his former personal trainer named James Horton. He's young and evil, and he's destroying the technology that allowed him to transfer bodies, while simultaneously getting rid of anyone who knows how it works. However, his bigger plan is to separate Eric from the Crow and turn the Crow into his own personal weapon. So he uses a strange ritual and separates Eric and the Crow into two different beings. And suddenly, all those things Eric hasn't had to worry about since his resurrection come rushing back. He is hungry, cold, exhausted, and vulnerable, but the Crow becomes this violent version of everything Eric has been trying to control. This is easily one of the biggest swings the show takes all season, with Eric literally being separated from the thing that makes him the Crow. On the other side, Albrecht is investigating who vandalized Eric's grave, which leads him to Judge Morrison, who is an ex-member of the Lazarus Group and wants police protection in exchange for information about them. But the Crow gets to Morrison and things quickly spiral out of control. We also see that Shelly gets a chance to return to the living world for a short time so that she can try to save Eric during his fight with the Crow. But the catch is that coming back means she will have to move on to the light afterward. Eric has now become mortal and powerless, while the Crow has become a violent force of its own and eventually manages to kill Eric. But Shelly grabs hold of both Eric and the Crow, which causes the Crow to merge back into him and bring Eric back to life. That comes at a huge cost, as she now has to leave for the light, and for a moment, she accepts her fate. After everything they have been through, this seems like their final goodbye. But at the last moment, Shelly can't bear the thought of being separated from Eric forever, and runs back to him, only to disappear into this mysterious cosmic ripple. That's where the show leaves them. Eric is alive, but Shelly is gone, and we have no idea where she ended up. I mean, we were supposed to get answers to all of this in Season 2, which makes the cancellation really hurt. After spending 22 episodes expanding the mythology beyond Eric's original revenge story, the show finally reaches its biggest supernatural conflict and then just ends. The second season that was already being considered. So A Gathering Storm was written as a cliffhanger, right? And the plan was to keep going. The show had even received positive reviews and had built a loyal audience. It was also doing well enough in syndication. More importantly, Variety reported in April 1999 that both The Crow, Stairway to Heaven, and Motown Live were returning for second seasons. The production was already moving in that direction, with writers developing stories for the second season. But then came the complicated corporate situation, wherein Seagram had acquired Polygram, and Polygram's television operations were absorbed into Universal's television structure. Universal was actually talking about keeping The Crow because of its international appeal, but they ultimately canceled the series, later describing the decision as being based on a combination of domestic and international factors. We don't really have a detailed explanation of what went on behind the scenes, so I wouldn't pretend we know exactly why the executives changed their minds, which is one of the most frustrating ways a show can die. The corporate changes just happened at the wrong time, and suddenly that cliffhanger had nowhere to go. There were plans for a TV movie to pick up the loose ends, or a 6-hour miniseries by Bryce Zabel that would pick up 5 years after the events of the finale, but neither actually happened. A cult series left between worlds. The show also found new audiences through reruns, including a run on the Sci-Fi Channel in the UK around the turn of the millennium. And eventually, the complete series got a DVD release in the US in 2007. So that's how the show has managed to stick around, although it's never become a massive mainstream hit. But it still has a loyal group of fans, and I think a big reason is that 22 episodes gave the writers room to explore Eric in ways that the movie just could not. Mark Dacascos just brings a different energy to Eric by being more playful and sarcastic at times, while still being able to sell the character's sadness and anger. His martial arts background is also very evident in the action series. I wish we could have seen what he would have done with another season. Anyway, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the show does not have any weaknesses. Like, some of the effects have aged terribly, and there are moments where the dialogue or action is peak late 90s television. But thinking about where all that development could have gone is exciting, even though we never got to see it. Eric Draven is still standing exactly where the series left him, and I guess it is supposed to fit because the entire mythology of The Crow is built around people who are stuck between worlds and unable to move on, with Eric being trapped between life and death, Shelly being trapped between waiting and moving on, and the series also eventually ending up trapped in the same place. And that's a fair way to look at the show, because if you go into Stairway to Heaven expecting another 1994 Crow, you are definitely going to miss the same gothic atmosphere, visual style, or the violence, and obviously Brandon Lee. But as a late 90s television series which is trying to turn that mythology into 22 episodes, I think there's more going on than the reputation of the show suggests. So that's where The Crow: Stairway to Heaven ultimately leaves us, and it may not be a perfect show, but I gotta give them their flowers for taking the basic idea of The Crow and expanding it to give Eric a much longer journey than the original story ever could. I would love to know what you guys think though. Did you enjoy Stairway to Heaven, and do you think it deserved a second season? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next video.